Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today is your 17th video lesson, and it is on how to multiply and divide integers using your brain. For today's lesson, you will need TOC number 17, the one you were given in class, a pencil or pen, of course, to take notes. Make sure your notes are neat. Highlighters, markers, or colored pencils. And this is part of the non-calculator section, so don't be using any calculators because you can't use them on your quiz. All right, let's dive into those notes. There's a couple things I need you to fix because apparently your math teachers can't English. The product or quotient of two integers with the same signs, I want you to add an S on the end of sign, will always be positive. So let me say that again. The product or quotient, meaning the answer to a multiplication or division problem with two integers that have the same signs, will always be positive. Let's go through some examples. If you look at 1 through 8 at the top of your paper, all of these are two integers that are either both positive or both negative. Obviously, we don't need to focus on the positive as much because that's what you learned in elementary school. What's new to you is having two negatives. So if you look at number 1, a -7 times a -2. Now look at number 1 carefully because this is how we write multiplication sometimes. We don't always use the X. We don't always use the dot. Sometimes they will write multiplication using parentheses and putting the number right outside or right next to the parentheses. That means multiplication. It does not mean -7 minus 2. Be careful. Make sure you understand that parenthesis notation can mean multiplication. So this means -7 times a -2. Negative times a negative, they have the same sign that will result in a positive 14. Same thing for number 2. A negative times a negative, they have the same sign. Your answer will be a positive 70. Numbers 3 and 4, both numbers are positive, so obviously this is like what you learned in elementary school. 26 divided by 2, positive is positive. Your answer is positive. I'm positive it's 13. Ha ha ha. Number 4, 16 divided by 4, your answer is 4, positive 4. Number 5, a -6 divided by -1 gives you positive 6. And number 6, -55 divided by -5 gives you a positive 11. Number 7, be careful, -7 times -8 gives you a positive 56. And number 8, -6 times a -12 gives you a positive 72. Looking at the bottom, so at the top we were talking about two numbers that have the same signs. Now, when we get to the bottom, we're going to talk about products and quotients of two integers with, cross out the, different signs and add an S at the end of sign. If we have two numbers that have different signs, like one's positive, one's negative, or one's negative and one's positive, your answer will always be negative. Let's look at the examples we give you in 9 through 16. They're the exact same numbers as above, but the difference is one is positive and one is negative. So looking at number 9, we still have 7 and 2, but this time the 7 is negative and the 2 is positive. One is negative, one is positive. They have different signs. My answer is negative 14. Number 10, I have a positive 10 and a negative 7. My answer is negative 70. With number 11, I have a negative divided by a positive. My answer is still 13, but because I have a negative and a positive, my answers are different. My answer in that situation, or my quotient, is negative 13. Number 12, a positive divided by a negative is a negative, and the answer is 4. Number 13, you guessed it, positive divided by a negative is a ding, 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 negative. 6 divided by 1 is 6. so it gets a negative 6. Number 14, a negative 55 divided by a positive 5 will give you a negative 11. And the last two, we have a negative 7 times a positive 8 is negative 56. And 16, you have a negative 6 times a positive 12 gives you a negative 72. Make sure you can understand same signs, you get a positive answer, different signs, you get a negative answer, but also look at how they're writing those problems. Sometimes your division is in a fraction form, and sometimes your multiplication is in the form with parentheses. Turn that paper over, and let's try some more. So we already talked about this. Same signs, your answer is positive. So two positive answers, like you did in elementary school, your answer is positive. Two negative answers, your answer is also positive. A positive and a negative, meaning one positive, one negative, different signs, your answer is going to be negative. A negative and a positive, different signs, your answer is negative. And here's a shortcut that all our students love. We've all played tic-tac-toe, so I want you to draw a tic-tac-toe board and that little box to the right. We all know when you're playing tic-tac-toe, the best way to win is diagonal. So I want you to put diagonal going either way. You can go to the left or to the right. It doesn't matter. Just one way. I want you to put 3 positives because that's the best way to win. We know that. All the other spaces will give you a cat game. So we're going to fill them in with negatives. So here's how it works. If you look at the top row, we had a positive times a negative. The third box going across that row is what your answer would be. A positive times a negative. We have one positive, one negative. That's different signs. My answer is going to be negative. If we look at a negative times a negative, let's look at the bottom row. Negative times a negative, same signs. My answer is going to be positive. And I'll show you a little bit more later on in the notes to explain that. One little thing I want you to write down. If you have an even number of negatives, meaning I have 2 negatives or 4 negatives or 6 negatives, then you're going to get a positive answer. Again, even number of negatives will result in a positive answer because you can pair those up in sets of 2 and get positive answers that you multiply or divide together. If you have an odd number of negatives, you guessed it, your answer is going to be negative. That means if I have 1 negative or 3 negatives in my problem, then I will get a negative answer overall. So write that down, pause the video if you need to, and then restart it once you've written those down. Let's look at the bottom, and I've redrawn the tic-tac-toe board that's up above, and I'm going to be using a highlighter to show you what to do. You do not have to highlight your paper as I do it, but I'm just using this to show you how we use this tool. Number 1, we have a negative times a negative. So I highlight negative times negative going across the bottom. The third box is my answer. My answer will be positive because I have an even number of negatives. So then all I have to focus on is my numbers. I already know my answer is going to be positive. What is 14 times 2? Positive 28. Looking at number 2, I have a negative divided by a positive. So let's find that in our tic-tac-toe board. The nice thing about this tic-tac-toe board, it doesn't matter if you go left to right, right to left, up or down to up. Any direction you go, you're going to get the correct answer. So all you have to do is find the pattern. Negative divided by a positive. Well, here's a negative divided by a positive. My answer is going to be negative. Negative 145 divided by a positive 5 will result in a negative 29. For number 3, we have a negative divided by a positive again. My answer is going to be negative. See, according to my tic-tac-toe board. So I know it's going to be a negative, and then all I have to do is focus on the numbers. 164 divided by 4 gives me negative 41. It's kind of like the battle boxes where you're saying who's going to win the battle. Just a shortcut. Number 4, we have a negative times a negative. So here it is in my tic-tac-toe board. My answer is going to be positive because I have an even number of negatives. All I have to focus on now, since I know my answer is positive, is 15 times 4, which is 60. Let's look at 5 through 8. 9 times a negative 11. That is not 9 minus 11, because if it was 9 minus 11, there would not be any parentheses. If there were parentheses like that, there's either going to be a subtraction sign or a positive or an addition sign in front of it if it's adding or subtracting. When the 9 is right up against the parentheses, that's multiplying. 9 times negative 11, so that's a positive times a negative. Here's positive times negative. My answer is negative. So I'm going to get 9 times 11, which is 99, but I know from my tic-tac-toe board it's a negative 99. Looking at number 6, I have a positive 54 divided by a negative. Here's positive divided by a negative. My answer is going to be negative. 54 divided by 9 is 6. So my answer is negative 6. Here's the tough ones. With number 7 and number 8, we don't just have 2 problems. We have 3. So we have to look. And here's where knowing the odd and the even come into play, or you can just break it into pieces and work through it like an order of operations problem. I have a positive, a negative, and a positive. That means I have one negative. An odd number of negative problems means my answer is going to be negative. So then I could just do 6 times 10 times 4 and know that it's going to be negative. Or I could also break it into pieces. A positive times a negative is going to be a negative. 6 times negative 10 is going to give me negative 60. And then I multiply negative 60 times 4 because that's what's still left in the problem. Now I have a negative times a positive, which also gives me a negative. So my answer is a negative 240. So that's the final answer, is a negative 240. Looking at number 8, this time I have a negative divided by a positive divided by a negative. I have 2 negatives. That's an even number. So if I have an even number of negatives, my answer will be positive. So let's break it into smaller chunks and I'll show you what I mean. Negative divided by a positive is going to give me a negative answer. 36 divided by 4 is negative 9. Then I have to divide that by negative 3. A negative divided by a negative will give me a positive 3. So my answer there is positive 3. Now before we move on, I want you to draw a triangle around the center hole of your paper. So where the 3 hole punches are, I want you to draw a triangle around the center hole of your paper. Again, draw a triangle around the center hole and the hole punches on your paper so I know you were listening. And now it's time to log into that quiz and prove to us you were listening and that you understand what you're doing. Get 100. You can do it.